What's up, guys? Welcome back to Bible Fun with the Duns. Today we're in Judges chapter number 20. Let's get started.
All right. Judges chapter number 20 is winding down the events of the book of Judges. We remember that at the end of the book of Judges, from chapter 17 to about chapter 21, this is an appendix to the book of Judges. It's not saying that these events happened at the end of all of the Judges. These are events that are probably happening all throughout the book of Judges. And look, they're not about any of the judges. What these events are saying is that in spite of the ministry of the judges, or maybe in some cases even along with some of the ministries of the judges, because not all the judges were great, these terrible things in Israel were happening. So yesterday we concluded with the story of where the Levite and his concubine go into a city and they are attacked in the middle of the night. She dies and
it gets worse and
worse.
It
gets worse and worse and worse. Chapter 20 picks up on this story. And Jen, tell us kind of a little bit what happens.
So he sends out the concubine as a message to all the people, and it stirs them up and they're angry. And we think that's a normal response. But then they think the answer to this problem,
is
this
murder.
Sin problem, is more violence. It's starting a civil war, basically. And so they're just stacking their sin on top of the other. It's getting worse and worse.
That's right. What's interesting, if you just start at the very beginning of the chapter, verse number 1 says, "So all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba." Well, we remember in earlier chapters when the Danites were traveling along. Remember when they found Micah and they found his Levite living in him, and they went up far north and they took over a city and they called it Dan after their family. They are the northernmost city of the nation. So it says they came out from Dan, and then it says to Beersheba, which is, if you go as far south as you can in Israel, that's where you'll find Beersheba. So now you've got people gathering from the northernmost tip of the country to the southernmost tip of the country. Everybody's coming together in this moment, and they're showing up, and they're showing up at the right place. As far as the land of Gilead, and the congregation gathered together as one man before the Lord at Mizpah, because Mizpah was where the Lord was to be worshipped. Now, here's what's interesting, is they came to the right place, but they didn't come to the right conclusion. And it's the same way a lot of us will go to the right place. We'll go to church, or we'll go to our Bibles, but we're not taking our church or our Bible with us when we leave. And so there's attendance, but there's no application. And that's what's happening. That's what's dangerous here. The other thing is notice who shows up to this meeting. And the leaders, it's verse 2, "And the leaders of all the people in the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword." All right? So who showed up to this meeting? Soldiers did. Here's the other thing. Here's the question though. Where were the priests? Where were the other Levites? Where are the other people of God? So soldiers showed up, but priests didn't. So you know the response they got? They got a soldier's response and not a priest's response. They got a war response, but they didn't get a spiritual response. And it was all a matter of who showed up. By the way, a lot of things in life are just about showing up. And if we don't show up and speak for the Lord, then the world is going to speak for itself. We notice that when this guy tells the story of what happened to this lady, it tells what the Benjaminites did to her, but he never says in the story, in verse 5, he says it like this: "And the men of Gibeah rose against me. They surrounded the house at night because of me. They intended to kill me, but instead they ravished my concubine so that she died." You know what he didn't tell them? He didn't talk about that in chapter 19, verse 25, he sent her outside.
Right.
So it's just their fault. He's the victim in this. Not just her. He's the victim. But he doesn't say what he's done. Friends, this is ugly. So the nation assembles with this righteous indignation. They're gonna fix this problem. But you know what they didn't fix it with? They didn't fix it with repentance. They didn't fix it with sorrow. They didn't fix it by turning back to the Lord. They fixed it with more violence. And this is not a change of heart. This is a reaction to what's happened. And this is why things get dangerous. Here's what happens in the story. All the Israelite tribes assemble and they go to war against the one tribe of Benjamin. And they go out to fight, and Benjamin beats them. And then they go back to camp and they go, all right, well, let's do this again. And they go back and fight. And day 2, Benjamin defeats them. On the 3rd day, they finally defeat the Benjaminites. Matter of fact, they destroy so many of the Benjaminites that only about 600 guys of these people are left. But I tell you what happens in the midpoint of this. Their failure on days 1 and 2 were actually the best things that could have happened to them. Because in the story, verse 26 says, then all the children of Israel, that is all the people, went up and came to the house of God and they wept. Well, now finally they're going to God's house and they're expressing some remorse. They sat before the Lord and fasted all that day until evening, and they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. So we see the spiritual behavior that comes from their defeat, which, by the way, just understand, there's a lot of good that can happen from a lot of defeats in our life. Matter of fact, we learn probably more in our defeats than we do our successes. And we notice even the change in their hearts. Because when they initially declare war, they declare war in verse 18 against the children of Benjamin. But when they're talking about Benjamin at the end, where they're getting their lives back on track with God, then they talk about him in verse 28 and they say, the children of my brother Benjamin. Well, good grief. Something is happening in their minds and their hearts, and it's all coming because they're facing who they are in front of God. Remember, this whole book is the story of what happens in a society that drifts from God. And it's a dangerous thing. And finally, it says in verse 35, the Lord defeated the Benjaminites before Israel. And at the end of the story, here's the other takeaway. It's not the Israelites who win, it's God who wins. And it's not because people die, it's because people come back to him. This is a terrible story, but it does tell us grace. Why? Because as bad as this world gets, the New Testament has already told us our God is able to work all things together for good for those that love him and are called according to his purpose. God gets their attention from some ugly stuff, but he begins to set their hearts on the right track. Now, they're not going to be great even after this. But I tell you what, they're better than they were. Sometimes it's the bad that brings the best good because the bad makes us look at who's the greatest. And that's God. Keep reading, keep studying. I know this is some difficult material, but try to see grace in it because God has still got the cross coming after the book of Judges. He doesn't give up on these people. He doesn't turn them away. He doesn't send them all to hell. He sends Jesus to the cross. We serve a God of mercy and grace. All right. We talk to you later. We love you. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.